Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and I'm here to share maybe some concerns with you guys who are new to PC3's pistol caliber guns with a third point of contact. Something like this. This is a CZ Scorpion Evo 3 S1 pistol, and this is what I'm using kind of as my archetype for a PC3. It's a pistol caliber gun, it has a third point of contact, that's a PC3. And the reason why I'm making this video is because, as a lot of you guys know, there's lots of people that I shoot with, and sometimes those people that I go shooting with see the guns that I have and they start gravitating towards them and they wind up liking them and they wind up with guns that they used to not have because of exposure to some of the guns that I have. And one of the guns that has been somewhat popular, not overly, but somewhat popular is guns like this, the PC3's. They're one of the guns that I absolutely love because before the whole pandemic thing, the ammunition was relatively inexpensive, at least for the 9mm ones. A PC3 can be any pistol caliber, but 9mm is usually the most common, and it's because that round is usually the cheapest. They're fun guns, they're true centerfire, so they have that kind of reliability. Not overly expensive, they don't have a ton of recoil, certainly not like a hunting rifle 30-06 or something like that. They're good recreational guns, and sometimes people look at them and mess around with them, mess around with one of mine that I let them play around with, and they decide, hey, I'd like to go and get something like that. And so they go and get one, and then the way that they wind up treating it, using it, to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense and makes me a little bit concerned. And so I'm going to share some of those concerns with you guys in the hopes that if you are new to PC3's pistol caliber guns with a third point of contact, that hopefully you can avoid some of the common mistakes that I see people make when they first get into these kinds of guns. The first thing that will bug me is storage. A lot of these people that I've kind of introduced to these kinds of guns, have had guns before, and there's certain things about storage that they understand. That if you're going to store the gun for long term, you should clean it first, make sure it has a light coating of oil on it to prevent corrosion and things like that. They'll get that. If the gun has electronics of some kind, whether it be optics or lights, lasers, those kinds of things, they'll understand that you should probably take out the batteries if you're going to store it long term. And just because the batteries will drain and be kind of a waste of a battery if you just leave it in there. And then sometimes the batteries will corrode out and can ruin your electronic if you leave them stored for too long, and depending on the temperatures and stuff like that. They'll get those kinds of things. But one of the things that a lot of times they don't get, and it's because of what kinds of guns they were used to before they got into these, is the issue of spring tension. A lot of people that I've shot with were frankly kind of revolver people. And revolvers, they do have springs in them, but spring tension and relieving spring tension and things like that is usually not a big deal with a revolver. The only real mainspring that you need to worry about is usually the hammer spring, and as long as the hammer is forward, it's basically good to go for storage. And that's kind of what people default to and they get trained on, and they understand that about revolvers, so it's not that big of an issue. But when they go to a PC3, a lot of PC3s are semi-autos. Others can be lever action guns. I haven't seen too many bolt action PC3s. Bolt action pistol caliber guns is not really a thing, but lever action and of course semi-auto are very common. And in semi-autos, these things run on their springs. That's the whole reason why they're able to operate, is because there is a balance between either the recoil forces or the spent gases and those springs that makes the whole thing able to operate. And sadly, springs do not have an infinite lifespan. They can last for a pretty long time, but it's not infinite. All springs will eventually wear out. But there are things that you can do that can kind of help them along, or things that you should not do to help them along, maybe is another way of saying it. And one of those issues relates to a feature that is meant to help you with these guns, but because people don't understand what it's there for, they sometimes wind up abusing it, and then it hurts. And that is the last round bolt hold open. the last round bolt hold open of a semi-auto is a feature that is there to help you in the process of actively shooting the gun. What happens is you stick a loaded magazine in the gun, you fire, 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 and then on the last round, the bolt will get held back. I'm going to go ahead and do that manually here. On this gun, it is going to be the charging handle on this little tab. This gun also has a locking notch, but not all semi-autos do, so I won't use that. But charging handle back, and then press this tab in, and that will lock the bolt open. It's now open, I can actually stick my finger in there. We'll lock the bolt open as if the last round of the magazine had been fired. This allows you, on the one hand, to look into the chamber area and see if the gun is in fact unloaded, that there's no round that is in there. And then it also helps in magazine changes. So you've come to the last round, the bolt has locked back. A lot of times you can feel it when the gun locks back, so you know that you're on your last round. Drop that magazine, put a new one in there, and then when you put the new one in there, your hand is usually going to be pretty close to whatever the release mechanism is, so you can release it and get back into shooting as quickly as possible. It allows you to check your chamber, and it allows you to change the magazines relatively quickly. And that's what a last round bolt hold open is there for. But there are some people that I see that are new to these guns. They fire, 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 get to the last round, the bolt locks back, they check in there and say, oh yeah, I'm done. And it'll be the last magazine of the day, so they'll go ahead and strip the magazine out. And then with the bolt locked back like that, they'll go ahead and put this into the gun case. That's really, really hard on the gun. That bolt has a usually fairly large spring behind it. That's called the recoil spring. And that spring is one of the most primary springs on the gun that really balances out the various either recoil or gas forces that the gun will be subject to and utilize, and it's that balance of that spring that basically makes the whole system operate. If you compress that spring all the time, it is going to wind up damaging that spring. Springs always last longer when they're left closest to what is called their point of equilibrium, their natural resting place, if you will. Think of a slinky and just setting it on the table. Normally a slinky is going to be fairly small. That's its natural resting point. And then if you stretch it out, you start to feel more and more tension as you stretch it further and further out. Letting it go to whatever its natural point, though, is where it likes to be, and usually the place where it's going to last the longest. There are other springs that, instead of when you pull them out, they start resisting you. It's when you compress them that they start resisting you. A recoil spring is like that. When you pull the bolt back, there's going to be increased resistance. And if it's under that increased resistance, it's going to wear out the spring faster. Do not store your gun like this. Okay, you're going to wear out that spring faster. Like I said, all springs will wear out, but doing this just does it faster, and that's not good. Okay, so get to the last round of the day. A lot of times the bolt will be locked back. Just go ahead and run the charging handle, pull it all the way back, let it come forward. That'll close the bolts. That'll release the tension on the spring. Your spring will last longer. You will get more enjoyment out of that mechanism. Okay, so that's one spring that's important to be aware of that some people aren't, and a lot of times it's just not being aware of how semi-autos work and those kinds of things. Another spring that can be an issue is the hammer spring. Let me go ahead and pull that out here. This is the fire control group of the gun, and it has the trigger mechanism, and of course what the trigger mechanism is connected to is the hammer. That's this piece right here. And the hammer is held back by a little catch, and it wants to fly forward. And there's these little springs down here at the base of the hammer that you can see. And that is what is trying to push the hammer forward. But most of the time they're held back. And that puts a lot of tension on that spring. And like I said before, the more tension that is on a spring, usually the shorter the lifespan, at least up to a point. If you want that hammer spring to last longer, release the tension. The easiest way to do that with pretty much all guns is before you put the gun into storage, to take a dummy round of some kind. Let me grab one here. Take a dummy round of some kind. some kind of a snap cap, something that is meant to be dry fired. Stick that into the chamber. Close the chamber on that round. Take the gun off safety, point it in a safe direction, pull the trigger. That is going to allow the hammer to fly forward. And since this was a dummy round, it's of course safe to do in an environment like this, but since it's a dummy round, there is not going to be any explosion. There's no recoil, there's no gases, there's nothing that's going to make the gun operate like it normally would, so that hammer is going to stay forward. Normally, if it was a live round, explosion goes off, the bolt comes back and it resets the hammer back down. But if there's no explosion, the hammer doesn't get reset, it's just left forward. And if the hammer is left forward, that means that that spring has been released. It's not under tension, or at least not as much as it used to be, and therefore it's going to last longer. So when you take a gun like this and you put it in storage, make sure that the bolt is forward and drop the hammer. And I recommend that you drop the hammer on a dummy round so that you don't ruin the firing pin. If you drop the hammer without there being a dummy round in there, sometimes it can ruin the hammer depending on the gun. Okay, dummy rounds are a good idea. And that leads me into my next point. A lot of people are just simply not familiar with the guns in general, and it's because they don't tinker with them. They don't get in there and figure out how everything works and those kinds of things. And one of the best ways to figure out how a gun works practically is to get some dummy rounds, stick them in your magazine, make sure you don't have any live ammunition around, but get a magazine with a few. You don't have to load it all the way, of course, but a few dummy rounds, stick it in the gun and practice running the action and whatnot and just see how things work. Okay, get a feel for the trigger pull and being able to dry fire it. Get a feel for running the action through and how all that operates. Having dummy rounds around that you can practice with, without actually setting off actual explosions, is a really good thing to do, and I wish a lot more people would do it. Dummy rounds, practice rounds are really, really, really good things to have, especially when you're dealing with semi-autos. Okay. Next thing that I wanted to talk about, in addition to storage and just the general good idea of having dummy rounds so that you can practice various things, like loading and unloading the gun, practice your trigger pull, things like that. Next thing I wanted to talk about is when people decide to take these and use them as self-defense guns. These are often people that are comfortable with handguns of one form or another, a lot of times revolvers, and they'll say, well, this also fires a pistol caliber round, and I've been using pistol caliber rounds for self-defense up until this point, so it's not like I'd be going down in power. And this thing is easier to get accurate shots with because it has a third point of contact, and oftentimes the optics on it are better than most revolvers. Revolvers, of course, have open sights, and those don't work as good as red dots and things like that do. And so they'll say, hey, why don't I start using this as, my home defense gun? It's obviously a little big for concealed carry, but around the house, why not? Might as well. If I'm okay with a 38 special, that is, revolver, well, this is going to be at least as powerful, if not more, usually holds more, easier to get on target, easier to maintain accuracy, easier to use at speed. Why not go for it? And I'm all for that, and I usually use this as my bedside gun that's light and portable, and I can take it on business trips with me like I am here in a hotel room. It's a very portable gun, and it does have that advantage of having the third point of contact, being easy to aim, use under stress, those kinds of things. A lot of those advantages. Obviously, it's not going to be as powerful as something that's in an actual rifle caliber, but it can get the job done. If you feel comfortable defending yourself with a handgun, then defending yourself with something like this is going to be at least adequate. It might not be optimal, it might not be great, but it's at least adequate. And there are a lot of people that I know that are simply more comfortable with something like this than they would be with a true rifle or a 12-gauge shotgun or something like that. This is just better for them. It is something that they're more comfortable with. And if that's them, go for it. But my concern with a lot of them that talk to me is that they're not always very practical about it. And what I mean by that is people say, okay, this is one of my defensive guns. that I use for defense, and I ask them, how, where did you have your gun yesterday? You say, this is one of your defensive guns. Where was it yesterday? And they say, oh, it was unloaded and locked up in a box under my bed. And I'm sitting there going, then how was it going to defend you? You can look at a lot of the information that is out there. For example, John Crea, who runs the Active Self-Protection YouTube channel, who has looked at tons of video documented self-defense encounters, has been able to show pretty conclusively that the vast majority of time, a self-defense encounter usually doesn't last any more from 7 seconds from the time that a lethal weapon is employed to the time that the encounter ends. 7 seconds. That's the total time. And the time that is usually wind up being determinative of, basically who wins or who loses, is usually the first 1 to 3 seconds is usually where you can figure out who's going to win this and who's going to lose this. So 7 seconds total, 1 to 3 seconds to make the determining action. If your gun that you're relying on to defend yourself is unloaded in a case under your bed or in a closet or in a safe, are you going to be able to use it to defend yourself? If the encounter doesn't last any more than 7 seconds and it's decided in the first 1 to 3 seconds, it's pretty safe to say it's not going to do a thing for you. If a gun is going to do you any good, it has to basically be ready to go, and it has to be sufficiently close to you for you to get at it in the time that you need it. And a lot of people that I know who have these things who say that they're defensive guns don't do that. They don't act like it's a defensive gun. They don't have it ready to go. And most of the people who are out there who would talk about how you would properly use one of these guns for self-defense, the best conditions to have it in, like John Crea, like John Lavelle, like Massad Ayub, all these people are pretty much all in agreement that what you need to have is a gun that is loaded. Again, using my dummy rounds here. Have a gun that is loaded. Make sure you have it around in the chamber and have your safety on. And that is the condition that your gun should be in if you're going to rely on it for self-defense. And have it any place that is relatively close to you. The general rule is within 3 paces, 3 steps. Okay. For me, I do a lot of traveling, and this thing comes with me on my business trips. I use it at night. Obviously, I don't use it in the daytime because it's definitely not a concealed carry gun. But at nighttime, this thing comes out. I have another gun that I can use in the daytime, depending on the legalities of the area. But yeah, at nighttime, this thing comes out, and it basically winds up coming around the hotel room with me. So when I'm at the computer, like I am now, it will usually be sitting off just to the side, where it can be easily grabbed. If I'm in the bed, it's going to be propped up against the nightstand. If I'm in the bathroom, yeah, it even goes there with me too. Wherever I am, it's usually within 3 steps of me. That's where it has to be for it to be any good. Now, the vast majority of the time, I do not have my hands on it like I have now. Most of the time, it's just sitting close to me, and I do whatever I'm doing, dinking on the computer or watching TV or some other mindless activity because, hey, we're Americans and we have lots of free time. Doing all that stuff, it's not like I'm actually, actively engaged with it, but it's always fairly close at hand. All that kind of fun stuff, and the refrigerator is making weird noises in the background, so that's what distracted me there. But it's close, and it's loaded. That's the only way that it's going to do you any good. It needs to be close, it needs to be loaded, and the only thing that should separate you from being able to fire it is basically the safety. Okay. That is the normal operating procedure for this kind of gun. So make sure you have the loaded gun and you have it relatively close at hand. If you say that this is your defensive gun, act like it. It should not be unloaded and under the bed. It should not be unloaded and hidden in a back place in the closet. It should be loaded, magazine in, round in the chamber, safety on. Okay. That is the standard way to do it. And that's about the only state that it's going to be relatively useful for you in. After that, I'd like to point out that the way that a lot of people shoot at the range, including myself to a large extent, the way that a lot of people shoot at the range usually has nothing to do with a real-life encounter. I mean, a lot of you will agree to this. Some of you won't, because some of you are, die-hard gun fanatics and self-defense advocates, which is great. And you'll realize that you need to practice in a real-world applicable way. But there's a lot of people that when they go to the range, they do not practice in a real-world applicable way. When they go to the range, they'll set up at the table, and they'll have a static target that is sitting out there. They'll load the gun up, point it at the target, take their sweet time getting all their rounds off, usually a full cycle. If it's a revolver, full cylinder. If it's a handgun, full magazine. Shoot until you get to the end, realize that you're empty, maybe unload the magazine, empty the rounds out of the cylinder of the revolver, and set it down. And do that a few times. The group is somewhat good out there on the target, pack it up and go home. The problem, though, is that there is no real-world situation to which that's going to be applicable. Okay, real-world defensive situations do not come with shooting tables, and in the real world, your target is not going to be static. It's just not applicable. And because of that, there's lots of people who think that they're going to be able to handle themselves who simply are not. And again, going to people like John Crea and those people that actually investigate real-world shootings that have been documented on video camera from security footage or cell phone or badge cams or whatever the case, they look at how these real-world situations go down, and that kind of static training that a lot of people do that they call training, and frankly I do it too. It's an easy habit to fall into. That static training has nothing to do with the real world. The real world is very dynamic. People who use handguns need to practice drawing them, because that's what you're going to have to do if you actually have to use your handgun, your concealed carry handgun. If you can't practice the draw, and maybe having to work the safety or not, because if you have the gun on safe and you don't practice using that safety, it can wind up biting you in the rear. And there's been cases that John Crea has looked at and other people have looked at where people drew a gun in self-defense and they started doing this, and the gun wouldn't go off. And the reason why it wouldn't go off is because the safety was still on. They didn't practice enough with the safety to actually make it usable in the moment. Same thing applies to these kinds of guns. If this is your bedside gun, as it were, you need to practice with it as a bedside gun. Load it up, put it around in the chamber, put the safety on, and then set it down if you can. And depending on where you're shooting, that might not be possible. A lot of the ranges, setting it down would basically mean setting it off to the side, and a lot of ranges are not going to want you to have a loaded gun setting out to the side, basically towards someone else who's going to be shooting on the line with you, so it's not going to be applicable there. But if you can, find a way to set it somewhere like it would be in a real-world situation, step back from it, and then practice going and grabbing it, disengaging the safety, and engaging the target. And not only engaging the target, but try to have a few targets that are set up out there. Now, if you're at an actual indoor gun range, you might not have a whole lot of space to work with. You might just have your little aisle. But try to make it as dynamic as you can. Get a few small targets, perhaps, and practice shooting from one to the other. A couple hits here, a couple hits here. Try to make it as dynamic as you can. Try to make it as real-world applicable as you can. Practice manipulating the safety as much as you can. That the gun always goes on to safe when you're done firing. You set it down. You practice grabbing it, disengaging that safety before firing, moving from target to target. Be as dynamic as you can, and also time yourself if you can. Gunshot timers are kind of expensive, but having somebody stand close to you with a stopwatch and getting at least a rough idea of how long it takes you to do something That's relatively cheap because most of our phones have stopwatches now. And it's not going to be super precise like a shot timer, but you'll at least get an idea of how fast or how slow you are. Okay, of course, be safe about it, be methodical about it. When you're practicing drawing your gun, practice it unloaded first and dry firing it. That's where those dummy rounds can be a major help. Practice with dummy rounds like I have here, and there's no limitation on basically where you can do that. Still be smart about it, still be safe about it, but that's one of the advantages of dummy rounds is you can practice practically anywhere and do those kinds of things. And then when it comes time to do live practice, you'll kind of know how things go and what you need to do to be safe from drawing or from grabbing from beside you, those kinds of things. Okay, practice in a way that's actually going to be real world applicable. And along that same vein, this is a pistol caliber gun. Pistol caliber guns are not nearly as powerful as true rifles. They're not nearly as powerful as a lot of shotguns. And because of that, it usually will take, not as many as people think, but it will usually take more shots to deal with a threat with a gun like this than either with a rifle or with a shotgun. And when you practice, you need to practice doing that. Now there's some people that will practice just mag dumping, and that is frankly not a good way to practice legally. That can get you in a lot of trouble if you fire more than is needed. That would be at minimum an excessive use of force. And if they decide that what you've done is criminal, it can also wind up affecting things like, is this manslaughter? Is this murder 1? Is this murder 2? Things like that. Firing excessively is definitely a problem, but like I said, it's a pistol caliber, so you usually do need to fire more than one round at a target as well. So practicing double or triple taps is usually what most people wind up doing with handguns or guns that shoot handgun calibers. So like I said, in your engagement, in your dynamic practice going from target to target, put a couple of targets out there and practice double tapping each one and then transitioning to the next one and double tapping that one, or triple tapping and then triple tapping the next one. But something that gives you multiple rounds but also tells you after a few rounds, stop and assess your situation. You need to practice the stop. You need to practice shooting more than one round, but you also need to practice stopping after a given point so that you don't wind up being guilty of using excessive force. Okay, and if you have a gun like this, and this one in particular has a 35 round magazine in it right now. It's not loaded to 35 rounds, it's loaded with just a handful of dummy rounds, but it can hold up to 35 rounds. And legally, if I dump this whole 35 round magazine into one suspect, there's a really, really good chance that I could be facing some criminal charges due to the use of excessive force. Okay, that has been talked about a lot. Masad Ayub, John Crea, on John Crea's B channel, Active Self-Protection Extra, he's actually had conversations with lawyers, actual self-defense lawyers, who talk about the issue of an excessive use of force. There was a particular case that they looked at in which someone had used a magazine that I think had 16 rounds in it. It was either 15 rounds in the magazine plus one in the chamber or something like that, but a fairly high round count, in which someone defensively had dumped the entire magazine into the bad guy, and that made them get looked at with a very strenuously by potential prosecutors, will say. Now, eventually it wound up getting cleared up and it wound up being a non-issue, but it definitely can slow down your life, and in some people's cases it will wind up becoming a very big issue. So practicing firing multiple rounds but also stopping at a given point so that you don't exhaust the whole thing is important. Okay. Just be real, be practical about it, those kinds of things. And then as a last but not least consideration when it comes to these kinds of guns is the issue of oil. A lot of people are very afraid of over-oiling their guns, and with most pistol caliber guns with a third point of contact like this, a lot of them are semi-autos, and for the most part it's really hard to over-oil them. There's only a couple areas that you need to be careful of. Make sure that you don't get oil in the firing pin channel, and make sure that you clear any oil out of the chamber. And aside from that, have at it. There's almost no such thing as too much oil when it comes to these things. Just make sure that you clean out the chamber of excess oil and stuff like that. Make sure that the chamber is dry, and also be careful of getting oil in the firing pin channel. And aside from that, you can pretty much put as much oil on you want in these things and it's not going to mess with them. And if you have a fairly rigorous training schedule and you practice a lot, you'll understand why having a well-oiled gun is an important thing with these things. A lot of times when people have stoppages and whatnot, it's because their gun wasn't lubed enough. And people like John Correa and John Lavelle and these people who are actual firearms instructors, Mike from the Mr. Guns and Gear channel, who was also a military firearms instructor, all of them continually say that the main problem that they see in their training is people who do not have properly lubed guns. Okay, if you're going to go out and you're going to fire 1 or 2 magazines, yeah, it's not that big of an issue. But if you're going to have any kind of serious training regimen and you want the gun to work when you want it to, most of these guns are designed to work with a fair amount of oil. There's a couple areas you need to be careful of, like I said, the firing pin channel and the chamber. But aside from that, you can put a lot of oil on these things and you're not going to hurt it at all. Okay, they run a lot better when they're wetter. Alright, so that is it. Those are the things that I have seen come up in no particular order, that I kind of hope that, you know, people will realize the error of their ways because John said so. Okay, maybe that's not the best logic, but hopefully you guys understand what my concerns are. Some of them are just, I want your gun to last longer, so make sure you relieve the tension on your springs. Some of the issues are training issues. Make sure that you actually train and you train in a way that's actually meaningful. Another issue is, readiness. Is the gun actually ready to be used? And if not, what kind of a defensive gun is that? It needs to be ready and it needs to be close to you. And then also just making sure that your gun can handle a rigorous training schedule, that you can put 50, 100, 200 rounds through it in a training session without the gun hiccuping on you. And that usually requires a fair amount of lube. That's just the way that a lot of these guns are. All right, thank you very much for your time and attention. I really do appreciate it. And I hope, before I forget, one last thing that I wanted to mention was the issue of where to zero these guns. Do you zero a gun like this at 10 yards, at 15 yards, at 25 yards, 50, maybe 100 yards? Well, there are going to be a lot of people out there with a lot of different opinions, and to a certain extent it doesn't matter too much as long as you know where your gun hits at what distance. That's basically the summary of it. But what I found works best for me is 50 yards. There's a lot of people out there who will do the more military traditional of saying 25 yards for your immediate zero, and that'll get you pretty close at 100 yards because the bullet will arc a little bit. And so if you have it zeroed at 25, once it comes back down from its arc, it's usually pretty much right on at 100. In a self-defensive scenario, though, you're usually not going to be firing at 100 yards. And most 9mm rounds in particular, that's what most PC3's are, most of them are 9mm. If you zero at 50 yards, you'll wind up with what is called a hanging point of impact. So the bullet is always going to basically fire where your aim point is, or a little bit below it, and out to about 100 yards. That's usually within 2 to 4 inches under your point of impact. Your point of aim is where the bullet is actually going to impact. So it's always there or just a little bit below, and it allows you to be fairly precise at those close distances. And it's just more practical in a lot of ways. And frankly, a lot of 9mm rounds out of guns like this don't do particularly well at 100 yards. A lot of the cheaper plinking ammunition is not overly consistent, and also between 0 and 100 yards it'll usually go through the transonic zone where it was supersonic, and then it slows down and it falls below that, and that transonic zone will usually destabilize the bullets. And so at 100 yards the pattern is usually fairly large and terrible with a lot of common plinking ammunition. But if you pull it back to 50 yards, you can usually hold a pretty decent group, or at least decent enough group, with pretty much any of the common ammunition that is out there. Much more effective, much more practical, for me, that's what works. All right, that's all that I wanted to talk about. Thank you guys very much. Have a wonderful day. Bye.